This is an episode of Crime World presents Caught in the Crossfire, which was first released in May 2024. You can listen to the full series as well as our other projects, Beast, the murder of Nora Sheehan, and Double Cross, the murder of Robbie Lawler, wherever you get your podcasts.
My relationship started with Brian Kenny when I was a young child because I got a job in his milk rounds, and that quickly went from delivering milk in Blanchardstown to being forced to deliver heroin and cocaine. Brian Kenny was a strange individual. The more I look back now, as I'm older and more mature, I can look back now and really see him for what he is. Brian Kenny was a, let's say, wannabe gangster.
The 80s had the General, the 90s had John Gilligan, and in the noughties it was the reign of Marlo Hyland. He ruled over the drug scene, working his way up the ranks, taking the opportunity to step in when others fell by the wayside. He grew increasingly reckless and paranoid and therefore became a liability. He had to go. And the circumstances of his death just added to his legacy. That an innocent young man doing an honest day's work lost his life is just terrible. You're listening to Caught in the Crossfire, Episode 2, How a Crime Lord is Made.
He had a good business going. There was 3 other people involved and they were charged with the sale of heroin when Kenny was caught the first time. That's Peter Joyce, Billy Kenny and Brian Kieran. They were all charged, they were all convicted, but they were all given suspended sentences. That was in 1999. And I believe, well, I know the reason they were given a suspended sentence because there was information being passed on from Brian Kenny to the guards. And he was also handing over goods and giving information on other criminals to get that sentence. He got a suspended sentence 5 years. Once he got the suspended sentence, that's where Marlo Hyland came into it. Now, I think Kenny was lucky enough not to get killed before that by Marlo Hyland, because what he was doing, he was selling on Marlo's patch. I knew who he was. Like, everyone knew he was the boss. He was the top dog. Everyone knew if you were living in that side of the city, you got your drugs from him. Hash, heroin, coke, everything all led to Marlo because it was his patch. Marlo is fair unpredictability, very unpredictable. You didn't know where you stood. And after Kenny's conviction and he got the 5 year suspended sentence, he started knocking about the Bradleys. He was getting in close with the 2 brothers. They were part of Marlo's crew, and I never actually seen them selling drugs. They are convicted armed robbers. That's what they were doing when I was there. They were doing armed robberies. They were doing jewellery heists. They were doing cash in transit, post office, bookies, you name it. They done it. And Kenny was doing everything he could to get in, because he was alone. He was kind of alone. He was always by himself and me. So he was desperate to get in with them, and they opened the door. He got one foot in the door, and basically he started leasing out the shed to the Bradleys and their associates. So when a robbery happened, they'd ring Kenny. Kenny could be with them, or I'd be at home in the house. They'd ring and say, open the shed doors. I'd open the shed doors. And God knows what, you wouldn't know what was coming through. And I remember one of the times, they told me to open the doors. I opened the doors, and a cash and transit van literally come into the shed. And then the doors open and everyone's in the back of it. But Marlo's not there. He never got his hands dirty. But I remember everyone counting the money. Kenny's counting stacks, the Bradleys are counting stacks, and then there's another bundle just getting put to the side. And that money's from Marlo. Even though he wasn't on the job, he still always got a cut. Always made sure anything that was done, he knew about it. And if he didn't know about it, they'd have to explain themselves. There was definitely a fear in Finglas, Blanchardstown and Ballymun of Marlo Hyland. Once Alan felt comfortable around Kenny, I think that's when he put the word in with Marlo, because the phone call came then from Fat Puss to say that Marlo wanted to meet Kenny. And then that was Kenny's just literally, it was a dream. I never seen anyone get so excited in my life. So the phone call came, we were in the shed, and Kenny's like, Fat Puss is after being on, Marlo wants to meet us. You know, 1 minute he was paranoid, thinking, am I getting set up? Am I going to walk in there and get shot? And the next minute he's like, this is their chance, this is the big time. And I'm like, just looking at him thinking, like, I don't want to meet Marlo. He knocked up a few lines of coke, and then he says, with a few lines that sniffed that, he sniffed it. And then he says, the lips get in the car. And I remember pulling up beside the pub. And we got out of the car. And we walked in. And as soon as we walked in, there was a stool. And there was a chap there called Shakur Dillon. And I knew Shakur Dillon. He was a bit of a mouth. And I think he thought he was a bit of a hard man. Now, but I think he was Marlo's lackey. Like, listen, I'm not putting him down for that. I'm just saying that's what he was. I was in the same position. And we walked in, and then there was just this round table in front of us. And there was Marlo on it. And there was Alan. And then when we walked in, I remember I was like just looking at him, but trying not to look, because I was afraid he was going to say, "What are you looking at?" I was standing there, and I remember my feet going back and forward, and I was just kind of looking straight ahead, thinking, like, don't talk to me, don't say anything to me, and I would just don't ask me any questions.
You wanted to disappear?
Yeah, because I was afraid I was going to say something wrong, get myself a fucking hiding, and I'm thinking, if they're going to shoot Kenny, they're definitely going to shoot me. Marlo Hyland's not going to let me walk out of that room alive after seeing something happen to Kenny. And they would have thoughts going through my head, because I knew he was informing, and I knew how dangerous Marlo was and what he'd do to someone that he believed was ratting on him. So we sat down on the table, and he says to Kenny, "Who's the young fella?" And he says, "That's the lips." And he says, "I don't like talking to people. I don't know." He says, he's like, Kenny says to Marlo, he's like my son, I trust him with all, like I trust him with my life, like he'd never tell anything. So we sat down on the table, and it was a round table, and he says, "Put your hand on the table." So I literally shit myself, to be honest. But I didn't know why he wanted me to put my hand on the table. Like, literally, all the things Kenny done to me, it was just weird. Like, I was like, put my hand on the table. I didn't understand it. So I was shaking, and I think I was only 14. Like, I remember, like, he put my hand forward, and my fingers were hanging over. You're afraid to scream out. You're afraid to say, "Please don't." So I just literally closed my eyes and thought he was just going to break my fingers. And then the next minute, just this big laugh, and he starts laughing, and Alan starts laughing, Kenny starts laughing, and he grabs me, pulls me into him, and hugs me, and is like, "You're a good young fella," and all this shit. And I was just so relieved that he didn't break my fingers. And I think he got pleasure out of it. Yeah, I think he thought it was in his mind it was a joke, but a sick joke in my mind. After he done the thing on the table, once my fingers didn't get broke, I was just literally sitting there, my hands under the table, and I was sweating, obviously because of the drugs and then the fear. So we sat there, they knocked up a few lines. Everyone had a line. We hadn't got a choice, you were told to have lines. Here you go. And then he started talking business, and then he was that desperate to be involved and to be respected and to be Marlo. He wanted to be in the paper, stuff like that. I think he got a bit of a buzz after the trial, and he got away with it. He felt invincible, and then going into this meeting with Marlo said to him, as I said again, sorry, I keep going off. He said, "I'm sorry to hear about your troubles with the smack." And he turned around and says, "You know, if you want to get back into it, all you have to do is give me a shoe." Marlo says, "Anything you've need, just let us know. I've heard a lot about you." He says, "I heard about the shed you have," and he was asking questions about the shed and saying everything, like, you're running a good operation up there.
It sounds like something straight out of a Scorsese mobster movie, although a lot grimmer. Joey's first-hand account of doing business with Marlo Hyland reveals how revered and feared he was for a time, the kind of people he had around him, and the loyalty he commanded, and how others, even though they knew how dangerous he was, wanted to get in on his action. But where did this man, who reigned over the biggest drugs operation in the country, come from? And how did he make it up that greasy and bloody pole? Born in September 1969, his was a fairly typical Dublin working-class background. The fifth of 7 children, his family lived on St. Attracta's Road in Cabra, where some relatives are still believed to be based. Although Marlo was considered a bit wild growing up in this sprawling suburb just north of Dublin city centre, it was nothing beyond the usual petty crime and joyriding that often plagued these neighbourhoods. But there was one event, when he was 16 years old, that's believed to have shaped the rest of his life and triggered his descent into a career built on violence, armed robberies and murder. On the night of the 20th of December 1985, Marlo's older sister, Julie, was raped and strangled by her alcoholic husband, Michael Brady. It's a horrendous story of horrific abuse, which the Hyland family tried to save Julie from on numerous occasions. Michael Brady was abandoned as a baby by his mother and raised by his grandparents. He was rejected by his mother again when years later they arranged to meet and talk. She stayed for only a few minutes, and as a result, it's believed Brady developed a mistrust and disdain for all women, which he took out on his young wife. Brady was a big man who severely beat Julie even while she was pregnant. She returned to her family home in Cabra at one point with their 2 small daughters, but Brady wooed her back with the promise of giving up the drink. But just before Christmas in 1985, Brady went on a bender after work and returned home that night to Julie, who was getting the house ready for the festive season. He raped and then murdered her in a mindless, drunken rage, and afterwards lurched up to his bedroom to pass out. The next morning, their 5-year-old daughter Elaine arrived downstairs to find her mother's beaten and lifeless body on the floor of the sitting room. She rushed upstairs to tell her dad that there was something wrong with her mum. She couldn't wake her up. It's a detail that must have haunted Marlo and the rest of his family for years, that a little girl should have experienced that kind of horror in her own home. Marlo's mum, Nellie, would later detail just how brutal her daughter's death had been. "I wasn't even allowed to see my daughter after he killed her," she once explained. The funeral director, he said he'd never laid eyes on a person who was so badly beaten. She even had a bone sticking out of her neck. In July 1987, Mick Brady pleaded guilty to his wife's manslaughter and was sentenced to prison for 10 years. The 2 little girls, Elaine and an 18-month-old Karen, went to live with the Hylands in Cabra, where they were raised by their grandmother. They later disowned their father and changed their surname from Brady to Hyland. Marlo was deeply traumatised by his sister's death and vowed to avenge the murder. He developed a deep bond with the 2 girls, who later described him as being more like their brother or their father rather than simply their uncle. His own upbringing in Cabra was already far from perfect. His dad was an alcoholic and his older brother suffered from illness. Marlo, at a very young age, was considered the man of the Hyland household. At a time when he could probably have done with some parental guidance and discipline himself, it would seem his sister's murder pushed him over the edge and into a more serious life of crime. Like, Marlo was one of those youngsters that he was hungry for money from the beginning, wasn't he? Like, there were different times. There was rent collectors going around houses collecting the rent from people in cash. And these young lads were hiding in the bushes, waiting for them to go past, jumping on them and robbing them. He was robbing insurance agents, anybody that was in the neighbourhood that might have had cash on them. And he was sort of stood out as fearless. He was a joyrider. He was on the motorbikes. He was the getaway guy. He was really kind of being schooled by himself, really, as a youngster.
Yeah, like a lot of those gangland criminals, he started off as a joyrider in the 1980s when there was an epidemic of joyriding, and Marlo Hyland earned a reputation as kind of a skillful joyrider, but particularly on a motorbike. When he was 18, he was convicted for a range of sort of motoring offences and ended up in prison. And that was probably throughout his life, despite rising to the very top of the criminal underworld, his convictions remained at that level. But they were holding up rent collectors, people going around. This is obviously a world of cash that's kind of gone now. And they were holding them up. And eventually that money was being invested in the drugs trade.
And it was interesting, really, because he went on to direct others to do these robberies, maybe more armed robberies and higher end robberies. But he did have that knowledge. Like, he wasn't one of those directors or company managers who was sitting back, never having pulled up his sleeves and got dirty in what he was asking other people to do. He wouldn't have been somebody you could have pulled the wool over his eyes. He wouldn't have accepted excuses if things went wrong, because he knew exactly how to do these things himself. And I think the timing as well, like, he was jailed for the first time there about 1987 when he was 18. But within the sort of the 3 years when he was released, you're talking the early 90s. And that's really when drugs become a career choice for young people like him. There's actually, a growing market. He can see that, and he can sort of start to gather around him a gang of pals that are from his neighbourhood and are going to be loyal.
Yeah, like a lot of people, when Marlo Hyland came out of prison, he'd already built up some of the contacts there, but he came out into a different world where the drugs trade had exploded, and the people controlling that drugs trade were John Gilligan and his gang. And Marlo Hyland had built up some of those connections in prison, and his gang started becoming one of the distributors for those drugs. He was particularly close to a guy called Noel Mullen, who had connections with the John Gilligan gang. Noel Mullen, in October 1997, was caught with £400,000 worth of hash. And in those years, Marlo Hyland had gone from maybe being a client of Noel Mullen's to being maybe somebody who was directing him at that stage. In his dealings with the Gardaí, Marlo Hyland, while he could be very sociable with the criminals, he was very aggressive with Gardaí. He liked to intimidate them. There was always stories about him getting his gang members to follow individual Gardaí home. He had a very confrontational attitude with them. He started building up this reputation, but when probably one of the most infamous libel cases in Irish history was when he sued the Sunday World. The Sunday World had named him as one of the up-and-coming drug dealers who had taken over John Gilligan's gang after John Gilligan's gang was smashed. He wasn't fully identified. There was a strip over his eyes, but he took the Sunday World all the way to court, denying he had anything to do with drugs. There was such a fear around him that people weren't willing to come forward and testify to his reputation on the street, which at that stage was considerable. And he walked away with a lot of money.
He walked away and he talked about it a lot. I mean, he celebrated it. There was a party that night in Finglas, and people would tell you that for quite a long time after it, every time he bought somebody a drink, would say, "That's on Paul Williams in the Sunday World."
I suppose it helped put this aura around him of being untouchable, smarter than everybody else, even though everybody regarded him as a drug dealer. And at that stage, probably the primary drug dealer in the city, if not the country, that he was able to pull the wool over everyone's eyes. And Marlo Hyland traded on that. He had a kind of a reputation as being that sort of godfather type figure that people would come to for advice, and he'd help sort things out with people. And also part of that was he couldn't be touched by the police, and he couldn't even be touched by the Sunday World. Of course, it didn't always end up like that in the long run, but that was certainly the aura he was projecting at that stage.
And of course, the early 90s, that was the golden era of cannabis. It was the most popular drug in the country, and it was where the money was to be made. That would later be replaced by cocaine. I think, at the turn of the new millennium, cocaine had certainly become the much more popular drug and where much more money was to be made. But I always find it interesting to see how Marlo set up a business model. He approached the whole industry in a business-like fashion. He used the skill set he had, which was in getaway driving, plus robbery, skill set he learned as a very young teenager. And he applied that to bigger robberies. And with that money, he'd buy from the wholesalers. He didn't, in his mind, get it easy. He had to work hard for everything he earned. And compared to the likes of John Gilligan, who of course got lucky because his first drug shipment was financed by the general, and the general was killed before he had to pay him back. So Gilligan walked away with the profits and the investment. And I think that's why you saw him rise so quickly to the Millionaire League. But Marlo would have always felt he had to really work hard to get to where he got. And he believed that everything he made was his?
He had a grand vision, I think, for criminality, where he wanted to work with other people. He liked to have other criminals and stay in touch with them. And he kind of tried to maybe have a national mindset, one of the first real criminals to do that. But robberies became an important way of funding drug shipments throughout his career, and they stayed right up until the end, until he was killed. Armed robberies were still being used because, of course, cash flow is really, really important in the drugs business. And particularly to be able to buy in bulk like that, cut down his risks and his initial investment.
Now, it's worth taking a slight detour here to look at the psycho. Here's another man whose name struck fear across the streets of Dublin for a number of years. From Finglas on Dublin's north side, Patrick James Judge spent time as a teenager in an industrial school for young offenders. As is often the case, he came out even more dangerous than he went in. Those who dealt with him believe he enjoyed inflicting pain on others, and he became known for torturing his victims, earning him his self-explanatory nickname. By the early 90s, he'd become involved in the drugs trade, becoming one of the biggest players in the country within a couple of years. Marlo happily teamed up with the psycho, picking up crucial tips of the trade from his mentor. And the men were close for a time. In fact, Judge ended up going out with one of Marlo's sisters, Ellen. It was a mutually beneficial relationship. Marlo was considered less violent and more easy to work for. At times, even he was shocked by the psycho's behaviour. Marlo Hyland obviously graduated into the big league thanks to one thing, and that was his relationship with PJ the Psycho Judge, who was a notorious character in the Finglas area, the first of the big gangland characters. And he didn't earn that name lightly. He was described as somebody with probably suffering from some sort of a mental disorder. I think it was agreed in the aftermath of his death that he possibly suffered from some sort of a schizophrenia or a personality disorder. And PJ Judge liked Marlo. He was a hard worker and he saw him as somebody who would do his bidding. But he was also in a relationship, of course, with Marlo's sister. And the psycho Judge had this ability to be insanely jealous of anybody else around him. And actually, the killing of Jock Corbally is all to do with jealousy. And it seems something that's so far removed from gangland and organised crime, because it's not an organised thing. It's just it appears that it was the psycho reacting to this emotional surge that every time he laid eyes on Jock Corbally, he just experienced this intense jealousy. Now, years later, after Jock Corbally, of course, his body was never found. He was disappeared as such, but the rumours were put about as to how he died. And years later, I went with Jock Corbally's brother, Derek, who used to go digging the fields in Kildare day in, day out, looking for his brother. He often used to go on a whim, maybe a belief that he might have been in this field or that, or sometimes on a tip-off. And he had set up his own sort of confidential call line that people could ring with anything. Now, his brother Jock was a bit of a sort of a boyo. He had a personality that made him very attractive to women, and he had good looks and perfect teeth. He wasn't an angel. Nobody ever suggested he was. He was dabbling in things. He certainly wasn't a big league player, but he beat up Judge at one point after he found out that Judge was trying to involve his sons in selling drugs. And he was absolutely furious with Judge, but it was a kind of a reaction that I'm sure he went on to regret, because Judge didn't take it lying down. I mean, he made it known that he was going to kill Corbally.
Yeah, it was a murder that didn't make sense, but PJ Judge was driven by some of those feelings of insecurity that if people disrespected him, it had to be met with this sort of extreme violent reaction. Jock Corbally was, as you said, a bit of a Del boy, a bit of a chancer maybe, but he was quite popular in the local area, a good looking guy. And when he confronted PJ Judge and beat him up due to this row over his kids, like that was something that PJ Judge, because of that sort of psychopathic nature, being disrespected publicly, and with the knowledge of the local community, it had to be met with this absolute extreme violence to absolutely stamp out anything of that sort. So on February 1996, Jock was abducted. It is believed he was tortured by PJ Judge. According to sources, what happened was that all of his teeth were smashed in, and he suffered a horrendous torture before he was actually killed. But, you know, that killing maybe sparked the end of PJ Judge, because there was genuine revulsion from within the community. As you said, Jock Corbelly's family, instead of being intimidated into silence, they spoke out publicly. They kept the campaign on and the pressure on, and people in the community in Finglas, whatever about people being killed over, you know, who are trying to kill each other, to see somebody killed for something so relatively trivial, I think really brought this attention on PJ Judge, and this belief that he couldn't be allowed to continue on like that forever.
Of course, Judge put out that Jock Corbelly had skimmed off a heroin shipment on him that he had stolen from him, because that seemed to be more reason maybe to take the action he took. He wasn't going to admit that he was jealous of this guy, or that he was, you know, he felt he had beaten him publicly like the way he actually did, and that he was jealous of him. He couldn't admit that. He couldn't admit that he was jealous of this guy's good looks and his charm. But he, like the Corbelly family, heard rumours over the years, and they were even told at one point that Jock Corbelly was alive when he was buried by PJ Judge. Such was his hatred for him. I mean, like scenes out of a nightmare movie. He was taken, he was bundled into the back of a van, brought down somewhere into the countryside in Kildare, and literally beaten, not to death, according to the rumours that came back, but that he was still breathing when they started. They were told that Judge had a grave pre-dug, and that he was thrown into it. And as the sods of earth started being thrown on top of him, that he was still breathing, which was a horrific. And of course, the fact that the family never found his remains was they're still looking.
They're still looking, and the Sunday World in particular started doing a lot of front page stories on PJ Judge, and all of that type of murder. It brings this intense focus on criminals, particularly at that time when there were some of the other criminal figures were sort of being out of commission. PJ Judge really became public enemy number one. At the time, of course, the IRA were in the background in Finglas, and they seem to have reached a conclusion with other criminals they were involved in, that PJ Judge couldn't be allowed to continue doing what he had been doing.
When Veronica Guerin was assassinated, of course, there was this link established between Dutchy Holland and Hyland, and it was discovered basically that Hyland had helped Dutchy make a run for it to the UK. Now, he was never convicted of her murder, but he has been named on a number of occasions as the one who pulled the trigger.
Yeah, I mean, Marlo Hyland seems to have fostered this relationship with Dutchy Holland for a long, long time. Even when Dutchy Holland was eventually imprisoned for drug offences, Marlo Hyland visited him 13 separate times in prison. Marlo Hyland collected these types of guys, and I think that was part of his grand vision for organised crime. He sort of collected these people as a status symbol. And he did the same with Desi O'Hare, another one of the most notorious gunmen in the history of the state, who had been involved in the INLA and the IRA, and was a very feared gunman known as the Border Fox.
In the middle of Marlo's rise up the ranks of Dublin's drug trade, his brother-in-law Mick Brady was released from prison. Marlo wanted him dead, and the psycho was happy to help him. After getting out of jail, Brady got a job as a builder's labourer, which he held down for about a year. Those who came across him said he was a reformed character, eager to keep his head down. One evening in September 1996, after pulling into the car park of his apartment block on the North Liffey Quays, two men on a motorbike pulled up beside Brady's car. One of them pointed a revolver at the driver's window and shot Brady 4 times in the neck and body. Shocking photos of his dead body in the car seat, with his bloodied head thrown back and mouth wide open, ended up in the newspapers the next day. It was a brazen attack, carried out by underlings loyal to Marlo and who would never rat him out. But it did shine some unwanted attention on the gangster and his men. Over the following weeks, the Gardaí cracked down on their activities, making hundreds of arrests and some major drug seizures, including €160,000 worth of cannabis, which Marlo had ordered off the psycho.
The number one rule in drug dealing is the purchaser always has to pay up, even if the stash is seized. So there was no exceptions, and Judge was at this point becoming very volatile and paranoid because of all the publicity brought on by the murder of Jack Corbally. And the IRA, who were, at that stage, particularly strong in that Finglas area, had become involved. They were unhappy with the attention that PJ Judge's actions had brought on the area. It was disrupting their business, their ability to collect protection money. And the IRA decided to take action. And that wasn't uncommon at that stage. At that stage, the IRA, the Provisional IRA in Dublin, had this oversight role over criminality in the city. And they called a meeting with Marlo Hyland, who had a long number of connections with them, and decided to get rid of PJ Judge. And ultimately, he was shot dead by a gunman.
It's interesting, I suppose, to remind ourselves that at that point, Marlo's sister is going out with Judge.
Yeah.
It just shows the ruthlessness of that world. But nonetheless, no matter who he was going out with, who he was in a relationship, I think it was clear at that point when the IRA met with Marlo that his reign was coming to an end.
Yeah, and they had that oversight role, the Provisional IRA, a role that's long gone, but they would decide that people had to go. They decided these people are disruptive to their business model. And Marlo Hyland, because he was entrusted in that decision, was then in a prime position to become the number one criminal operating in that area. And for people to know that he had the backing of the IRA in what he did.
The killing of the psycho is yet another prime example of how there's no real loyalty between thieves. And sometimes you'll even put your family in harm's way just to get the required result. The decision had been made. The psycho was a dead man walking. On the 7th of December 1996, he went for drinks at the Royal Oak pub in Finglas with his girlfriend, Ellen Hyland. Marlo, as he often would, joined them along with another pal. At about midnight, the psycho and Ellen left the pub and got in the car. But before they could drive off, a gunman appeared at the window and fired 2 shots into the back of the psycho's head. Ellen, sitting in the passenger seat, was left unscathed. Almost immediately, Marlo Hyland made it clear that he was the new Don. There were few objections. At the start, he was considered a preferable boss to the psycho. He rewarded good work with lots of cash and was less erratic and needlessly violent. With his former mentor out of the way, Marlo got on with building up his empire. And in the meantime, over in London, Christine Campbell was raising her son while working as a cleaner in a hospital. The pair lived near the West End and had moved over when Anthony was just 18 months old. But life in London with a teenage boy was getting harder. It was time to come home.
Yeah, he didn't like it. He didn't speak to me for, we'll say, a couple of weeks.
Right.
He hated me. But I didn't mind that.
Yeah.
And I remember saying, he said, I'll never forget it. He says to me when we were in Greek Street, he said, please, Mum, take me back. I said, no, Anthony, I heard you. You didn't listen to me. I said, now, you had everything with me. Let's see what he can do for you. I know it sounds, but it was that or go the other way. You've done all the hard work and he gets a 17-year-old child. What was he said to me once? And I thought, fuck you. He says to me, why don't you chill out? I went, how dare you speak to me like that? I mean, years ago, your mother called you your Sunday name and you knew you were in trouble. So I thought, well, and you know what? I never hit him. Maybe I should have got because I thought the world's going to be tough on him when he gets out there. I'm kind of glad I had all the years with him to myself.
As with many teenage boys, there was a period when Christine worried about what path Anthony's life might take. And after returning to Dublin, it was decided he would live with his father and his family at their home in the Greek Street Flats complex in Smithfield in the north inner city. Anthony got an apprenticeship as a plumber and proved himself to be a good worker. In November 2006, however, the firm he was working for laid him off as part of a round of seasonal redundancies. But he found another plumber to work for, David Murphy. About 3 weeks into his new job, the pair were booked in to carry out a quick job on the heating system in Elaine Hyland's house in Scribbletown Park in Finglas. They were set to call in on the evening of Monday, the 11th of December, but that day had been particularly busy and they'd finished their other jobs later than expected. It was arranged they'd call into Elaine's the following morning instead. A decision that would prove to be yet another tragic sliding doors moment in young Anthony's life. Caught in the Crossfire is produced by Crime World. Writer and producer Jane Finnegan. Producer Claude Amini. Audio editor Jason Malini. Art and graphics Enda Bulger. Executive producers Nicola Tallant and Ian Malini.